In 2020, Cybercrime magazine wrote that if it was measured as a country, then cybercrime, which was predicted to inflict about $6 trillion in damages in 2021, would be the world's third largest economy, behind the United States and China. Insider magazine wrote in 2017 that billionaire Warren Buffett sees cybercrime as a greater threat to humanity than nuclear weapons. And yet cybercrime had humble origins. The early history of hacking deserves to be remembered. It might surprise you to find out that the term hacker has medieval origins, but it does. According to the online etymological dictionary, the word tracks back to a place called Hackney in Middlesex. Hackney is now a borough of London, but in medieval times it was pasture land, and the dictionary explains apparently nags were raised on the pasture land there in early medieval times. The word nag refers to a small riding horse or pony, as distinct from, say, a war horse, and the dictionary speculates that the word might be derived from the sound a horse makes, neigh. Since the nags raised in Hackney were typically rented out for hire, by the late 14th century, Hackney had become a general name for a horse for hire. The name eventually passed to the horse cabs that were taken for hire, hackney cabs, which became common in London starting in the 1600s. The word was shortened to hack and started to be applied both to the cabs and their drivers, and in fact, cab drivers are still sometimes referred to as hacks, and thus hack became the name of a person who operates for hire. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary Online takes up the story. It didn't take long for hack to catch on in other fields, referring to anyone who works for hire. In particular, hack carries the insinuation that the work is produced to fulfill an assignment and not expected to be original or risk-taking. And perhaps because of that, there comes the suggestion that the work of a hack in any field is unexceptional. One of the more common uses of the term is for writers. The online etymological dictionary defines a hack writer as one who writes anything for hire. Hack writers are generally seen as being paid to ground out high volumes of low-quality work. The online etymological dictionary explains that the term hack writer was in use by 1826. The idea of a hack writer then explains the next evolution of the word, as the online etymological dictionary explains. The computer use is said to be from tech slang, in sense of one who works like a hack at writing and experimenting with software, who enjoys computer programming for its own sake. Reputedly a usage that evolved at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. By 1975, that term had evolved with the first attested use of the word hacker, meaning a person, apparently one of those computer hacks, that gains unauthorized access to computer records. Thus, hackers track their name back to these small horses, called nags, although the online etymological dictionary suggests the term might be a convergence with the verb hack, meaning to cut roughly. The Associated Press gave a description in 1989. Typically young, smart males who rarely become nose guards and often found in schools whose initials end in T for tech. Nerds with acne who devise fiendish booby traps to blow the fuses of the Republic's vital computer systems. But there is another interesting twist, as the online etymological dictionary writes. However, an MIT student from the late 1960s recalls hack being used then and there in the general sense of a creative prank. Thus, the term hacker is related to people who work like a hack at writing computer programs, but also pranksters and people who are wantonly destructive, hacking things to pieces. And in that context, I was somewhat surprised when I went to research the history of hacking to find references to a hack that occurred before the internet, the Great Rose Bowl Hoax of 1961. The Los Angeles Times explained in 2010. A small band of ingenious Caltech students made it happen, surreptitiously altering a University of Washington halftime flip card routine so that it would spell out Caltech in what became known as the Great Rose Bowl Hoax of 1961, a stunt that has been called the greatest collegiate prank of all time. The perpetrators of the prank used the appropriately devilish title of the Fiendish 14. The Times quotes Lynn Hardy, the leader of the group. Making it happen, he notes, required duplicity, espionage, lockpicking skills, and more than a little good fortune. In short, they posed as reporters to get members of the University of Washington cheerleading squad to tell them the details of a card-turning routine. One of those routines where members of an audience hold up cards and it makes a larger picture, usually shown on television, to be shown at the Rose Bowl, being played between the Universities of Washington and Minnesota. They then picked the locks and broke into the cheerleaders' rooms, stole the master instructions and cards, and replaced them with their own. In the middle of the game, the cards first spelled Washington backwards, and then flipped to spell Caltech. The unexpected appearance of Caltech at the Rose Bowl then sparked laughter from the assembled crowd and sportscasters who were announcing the game. The Seattle Times reported the next day that a Caltech student who preferred to remain anonymous told them that the stunt involved more than 170 man-hours of work, and that one conspirator said the plot involved substitution of 2,232 phony Reuters instruction cards. It might be difficult to see the connection to computer hacking at first, but consider the fiendish 14 identified a vulnerability in a system, gained unauthorized access, and altered the code to change the outcome of a program. If it's not part of the history of computer hacking, it is at least part of its prehistory. Lyndon Hardy went on to be one of my favorite fantasy and science fiction authors. The connection was made more explicit in 1984, when, according to the New York Times, 2 Caltech students spliced a remote control computer and other electronic gadgets into the wiring of the scoreboard at the Rose Bowl so that instead of showing the score between the University of California at Los Angeles and the University of Illinois, the board read that Caltech was leading the Massachusetts Institute of Technology by a score of 38-9. Before the World Wide Web, there was the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, or ARPANET, the first packet-switched network. That is a system that sends data as packets over a digital network. The New York Times described the beginning of the first computer network in 1999. In 1966, as a director of the Pentagon's Advanced Research Projects Agency Information Processing Techniques Office, Robert W. Taylor came up with the idea for the Internet's precursor, the ARPANET. After authorizing money for research to develop a nationwide computer network, Mr. Taylor wrote a white paper in 1968, a year before the network was created, with another ARPA research director, J.C.R. Licklider. The paper, The Computer as a Communications Device, was one of the first clear statements about the potential of a computer network. The initial start was not auspicious, as the website of the History Channel explains. On October 29, 1969, ARPANET delivered its first message, a node-to-node communication from one computer to another. The first computer was located in a research lab at UCLA, and the second was at Stanford. Each one was the size of a small house. The message, "Log in," was short and simple, but it crashed the fledgling ARPA network anyway. The Stanford computer only received the note's first 2 letters, LO. ARPANET didn't seem to worry much about the threat of hacking. One of the most notorious computer crimes of the period was in 1973, when legendary developer Lynn Kleinrock, a UCLA professor often referred to as the father of modern data networking, used ARPANET to contact a colleague in the United Kingdom and ask him to retrieve an electric razor that Kleinrock had forgotten at a conference. The use of the government network intended for official purposes for a personal errand was not illegal, but at least a breach of protocol. The Washington Post reported in 1996. Kleinrock had that feeling that the stunt he'd pulled was slightly out of bounds. It was a thrill. I felt I was stretching the net. Still, like a halftime at a Rose Bowl game, the idea of malicious software came early. A 2009 edition of The Guardian writes, computer viruses and worms, essentially just self-replicating programs, were predicted as early as 1949 by the mathematician John von Neumann. And it's generally accepted that the first was a virus called the Creeper, which infected ARPANET in 1971. For its nefarious name, Creeper, however, was not as destructive as its namesake in the game of Minecraft. The Guardian continues, it was created by an engineer called Bob Thomas. Creeper was not, however, malicious. Infected machines would simply display the message, "I'm the Creeper, catch me if you can," but didn't suffer any lasting damage. The website of cybersecurity firm Exabeam explains, although they didn't know it at the time, they were the first computer virus victims. But what did the mysterious message mean, and who sent it? It turns out it wasn't a hacker who coded the first computer virus, and it wasn't sent with malicious intent. Bold, Beranek, and Newman, now Raytheon BBN Technologies, were pioneers in packet-switching networks like ARPANET and the Internet. One of its researchers, Bob Thomas, had created Creeper as an experimental computer program. Still, it seems that the challenge was accepted, as the Creeper then resulted in another first, the first antivirus software. The Guardian continues, the first piece of antivirus software was created as a direct response to the Creeper's challenge. The Reaper was also a self-replicating program, which spread through the system in much the same way that the Creeper had, and removed the offending virus from infected computers. Just as quickly as it had spread, the Creeper was caught. Computer viruses don't require networks. By the 1980s, viruses were being passed among personal computers, usually via disks. The Exabeam website explains, following Creeper, which was isolated within the realm of researchers, Elk Cloner was the first personal computer virus to be detected in the wild, meaning outside of the lab in which it was created. Written in 1982 by a 15-year-old high school student named Richard Skrenta, it was a boot sector virus that infected Apple II computers. It spread by way of the then state-of-the-art removable storage technology, the floppy disk, to become the first major computer virus outbreak. Apple's competitor Microsoft also experienced vulnerability. Television network CTV News wrote in 2007. The first virus to hit computers running Microsoft Corporation's operating system came in 1986, when two brothers in Pakistan wrote a boot sector program now dubbed Brain, purportedly to punish people who had spread pirated software. Although the virus didn't cause serious damage, it displayed the phone number of the brothers' computer shop for repairs. The Brain virus was spread via infected 360-kilobyte diskettes. But the web offered a different level of vulnerability, the Christian Science Monitor noted all the way back in 1988. One of the benefits of computers is the ability to make large amounts of information available to many users simultaneously. But the drawback is that anyone who could connect up with a computer can potentially introduce into that computer destructive programs. What programs like Elk Cloner and the Brain virus lacked was an easy way to infect huge numbers of computers. What they lacked was the World Wide Web. But the web, or at least its precursor, were about to see something that was much more dangerous than the creeper virus. While ARPANET and its successor NSFNet, referring to the National Science Foundation, grew over time, it wasn't until 1993 when researchers at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, provided source code for an early internet browser and editor called World Wide Web to be used without royalties, that access to computer networking really opened to the general public. The website of authentication software developer Hyper explains. In 1988, the use of computers, let alone the programming of them, had not yet taken foothold in the U.S. Wouldn't mean until a few years later that word processing applications and other familiar interfaces became familiar. Still attached to academia and government, the 60,000 or so computers connected to the Internet, rather its precursor, the ARPANET, were a sort of experimental and intellectual playground for those developing the technology and learning it. That's right. In 1988, the web only connected some 60,000 computers. And according to the website of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, at about 8:30 p.m. on November 2nd, 1988, a maliciously clever program was unleashed upon the Internet from a computer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This clever program was what would come to be called a worm. Web identification software developer Okta explains the meaning of the term worm. Every computer needs an operating system. This program runs in the background, and you may never notice how it works or what it does. But it's critical to your performance, and you can't turn it off. A worm targets vulnerabilities in the operating systems. Then adds, think of the Morris worm as the grandfather of every single worm out there. The worm hit a world largely unprepared for it. Technology site NZNet explains, on Wednesday, November 2nd, 1988, the Internet was still young, small, and dominated by academics and engineers. It was all very collegial, and there wasn't much in the way of security work, even if the topic existed in theory. The Morris worm was, if not the first, one of the oldest computer worms to be distributed across the Internet. Christian Science Monitor wrote on November 24th, 1988. This month, the computer worm created by Cornell University graduate student Robert Morris Jr. copied and electronically mailed itself to computers connected to ARPANET, a computer system designed for academics that links computers like the telephone infrastructure links telephones. The Morris worm entered computers by cracking passwords, exploiting a loophole in an electronic mail program, and overflowing memory so that the overflow would be read as commands. The FBI describes the initial impact. We are currently under attack, wrote a concerned student at the University of California, Berkeley, in an email later that night. Within 24 hours, an estimated 6,000 of the approximately 60,000 computers that were then connected to the Internet had been hit. Berkeley was far from the only victim. The rogue program had infected systems at a number of the prestigious colleges and public and private research centers that made up the early National Electronic Network. Among the many casualties were Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, NASA, and the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. It is possible that the worm was not actually intended to cause harm, Hyper explains. Robert Morris, like his late 1980s contemporaries, was as interested to learn the potential of computers as he was in their substance. A programming student at Cornell, he developed his self-replicating program to test the boundaries of the network, a sort of penetration testing. But if the goal was not to cause computer systems to fail, that was the result. Okta explains. The Morris worm was made to query. The worm asked each computer it encountered if it already had a copy of the code. Respond to no if the computer wasn't infected, the code would execute. Respond to yes if the computer was infected, the worm wouldn't copy. This code seems innocent, but Morris didn't want clever programmers to work around him and prompt all of their computers to respond yes to every copy. So after 7 yes responses, the code duplicated anyway. This flaw devastated computers. Many had several versions of the code running at the same time, and performance slowed to an absolute crawl. Some systems crashed altogether. The FBI details some of the damage. The worm didn't damage or destroy files, but it still packed a punch. Vital military and university functions slowed to a crawl. Emails were delayed for days. The network community labored to figure out how the worm worked and how to remove it. Some institutions wiped their systems. Others disconnected their computers from the network for as long as a week. The exact damages were difficult to quantify, but estimates start at $100,000 and soared into the millions. The Christian Science Monitor notes, according to one estimate, the worm wasted $96 million in computer work and time nationwide. But, of course, at the time, nobody was using the term Morris worm because nobody knew who had created the program. The FBI writes, as computer experts worked feverishly on a fix, the question of who was responsible became more urgent. Shortly after the attack, a dismayed programmer contacted 2 friends, admitting that he had launched the worm and despairing that it had spiraled dangerously out of control. He asked one friend to relay an anonymous message across the internet on his behalf, with a brief apology and guidance for removing the program. Ironically, though, few received the message in time because the network had been so damaged by the worm. The break actually came via the New York Times. Hyper writes, a friend of his, accounts say, tipped off the New York Times, giving them Morris's initial. The FBI writes that when talking to the Times reporter, the friend inadvertently referred to the worm's author by his initials RTM. Using that information, the Times soon confirmed and publicly reported that the culprit was a 23-year-old Cornell University graduate student named Robert Tappan Morris. The FBI described Morris as a talented computer scientist who had graduated from Harvard in June of 1988. After being accepted into Cornell that August, he began developing a program that could spread slowly and secretly across the internet. While Morris's friend had told the Times that the program was meant as a harmless experiment and that its spread was the result of a programming error, Hyper notes that, while opinions may still vary on his motives, one fact still stands. He concealed his activities by hacking into the Massachusetts Institute of Technology network to launch his worm, attempting to cover his tracks. And Morris would then experience yet another first, the FBI writes. In 1986, Congress had passed the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, outlawing unauthorized access to protected computers. Prosecutors indicted Morris in 1989. The following year, a jury found him guilty, making him the first person convicted under the 1986 law. Morris's worm was so destructive that Hyper notes it's been called the Great Worm, a nod to dragons from the stories of fantasy author J.R.R. Tolkien. Certainly the worm caused devastation in its day, Hyper writes, and gave birth to fear. But the cost wasn't just in the lost time and resources, but in the way that the first widely reported and one of the most destructive worms ever impacted the entire information sharing community. In 2019, the website Mashable opined, but in the beginning, the very, very beginning, computers inspired utopian visions of a better future, a world in which we were all digitally connected to one another and living in harmony. Then came the Morris worm. Hyper describes the Morris worm as one of the most significant events in computer science history. The Morris worm was the first instance of a network computer or group of computers' helplessness. With the Morris worm, vulnerability, as we now term this sort of jeopardy, quickly occupied the mindset of all who were associated with computing: scientists, developers, students, and government officials. For his conviction, Morris was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and $13,326 in fines. He went on to become a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The original floppy disks that have the Morris worm on them are on exhibit at the Museum of Computer History in Mountain View, California. Experts tell us that the Morris worm wouldn't work today, but we live in a world of much greater cyber threats, which some say were inspired by Morris and his worm, although ZDNet is of the opinion that had Morris not released his eponymous worm, someone else would have done something similar, and perhaps with genuine malicious intent. But still, Morris and his worm changed the way that the world saw computers. Hyper says that it is one of the most important events in computer history. November 2nd, 1988, they say, was the day that computer science lost its innocence. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.